In the past couple of months, while most of the world has been watching Iran's economy implode and the rial collapse to roughly 1.8 million per dollar, the country quietly profiting most from this war isn't actually fighting in it. Russian Urals crude, which for nearly 4 years traded at a $20 to $35 discount to Brent under the G7 price cap, has narrowed that gap to as little as $6 below Brent. Indian refiners are reportedly paying premiums of $7 to $9 per barrel above dated Brent for Russian cargoes. Russia's mineral extraction tax revenue from oil doubled in April to roughly 700 billion rubles, or about $9 billion in a single month. And the U.S. Treasury itself issued waivers in March allowing Indian refiners to take delivery of sanctioned Russian shipments already at sea. So in this video, we're going to explain how the sanctions architecture that took 4 years to build has been functionally undermined in a matter of weeks, what it means for Russia's revenues in 2026, and how the geopolitical realignment underneath it is starting to take shape. If you love staying informed and want some of the best reporting on YouTube, then subscribe and ring the bell for more. So let's start by explaining how the Urals-Brent spread actually collapsed. For context, since 2022, the G7 imposed a $60 per barrel price cap on Russian seaborne crude, enforced largely through Western shipping insurance and finance. This was the load-bearing piece of the sanctions architecture, and it's why Urals traded at such a steep discount to Brent for so long. However, when Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz in late February, traffic through the strait collapsed from roughly 125 daily transits to fewer than 10. Brent climbed to around $116 a barrel, and physical cargoes were reportedly trading at premiums of $35 to $50 above the front-month futures, an unprecedented divergence. In that environment, buyers stopped caring about compliance and started caring about barrels. Indian-Russian crude imports nearly doubled in March to between 1.98 and 2.25 million barrels per day, accounting for roughly 47 to 50% of all Indian oil imports that month. China, which had quietly built up around 1.4 billion barrels of strategic reserves using discounted Russian and Iranian crude, kept buying. And the shadow fleet, now estimated at around 1,900 tankers globally, moved roughly 48% of Russia's seaborne exports in March, according to the EU's 20th sanctions package. It's worth noting Russian warships have even begun escorting some of these shadow tankers through the English Channel, directly challenging UK interdiction efforts. The point we're trying to make is that the price cap didn't fail because of clever Russian engineering alone. It failed because Western governments themselves issued waivers the moment fuel prices threatened domestic politics. This brings us to Europe, where the picture is, if anything, more uncomfortable. For context, Qatar had become the EU's primary replacement for Russian pipeline gas after 2022, and most of those LNG shipments transit Hormuz. When the strait shut, European TTF gas prices spiked roughly 68% within 2 days of the initial strikes, hit highs around $78 per MMBtu in March, and Goldman Sachs has since warned prices could test 75 to 100 euros per megawatt hour if flows remain suppressed. European storage entered April at just 28% capacity against a 5-year average of 41%, and the IEA's Fatih Birol described the situation as, quote, the biggest energy security threat in history. In that context, Russian Yamal LNG cargoes have quietly continued reaching European terminals via transshipment and reflagged shadow vessels, even as the EU's 20th sanctions package tries to plug the gaps. Anyway, the second thing to talk about is the actual revenue math, because the headline figures here need handling carefully. Russian seaborne crude exports averaged around 4.6 million barrels per day in March, up 270,000 BPD month on month. The Kyiv School of Economics Institute estimates Russia could see between $45 billion and $151 billion in additional budget revenues from the conflict, depending on how long it lasts. Multiple independent projections put 2026 total oil and gas revenues on track to exceed $200 billion. However, we'd note one important caveat. Russia ran a 4.58 trillion ruble federal deficit in Q1 2026, roughly $61 billion, which already exceeded the projected full-year deficit. Ukraine's drone strikes on Baltic export terminals and refineries forced Russia to cut production by an estimated 300,000 to 400,000 barrels per day in April. So the windfall is real, but it's landing on top of a fiscally strained wartime economy, not a healthy one. What's more telling is that Russia's central bank confirmed it will resume National Wealth Fund foreign exchange purchases in May, because Urals is now trading well above the $59 budget cutoff price. In other words, the windfall is just beginning to flow into sovereign reserves rather than out of them. So, what does all of this actually mean structurally? Well, as we see it, the more interesting story isn't the revenue figure itself, but the realignment underneath it. Roughly 90% of Russia's Q1 crude exports went to China and India. The UAE formally exited OPEC and OPEC Plus effective May 1st, removing the cartel's third largest producer and arguably triggering what some analysts are calling an existential crisis for the group. 99.1% of Russia-China bilateral trade is now reportedly settled in rubles and yuan, and the UAE has apparently warned Washington that prolonged dollar shortages could push it toward yuan settlement for oil sales, the first real crack in the petrodollar arrangement in decades. Ultimately, whether this Hormuz windfall becomes a temporary fiscal sugar rush for Moscow or the start of a more durable shift in the world's energy and currency architecture depends almost entirely on how long the strait stays disrupted and whether the OPEC fragmentation accelerates from here. For now, though, the sanctions architecture that took 4 years to build is, for all practical purposes, no longer doing the job it was designed to do.